correct that, and I'm doing my duty today to moderate this panel. It's sort of the first step of that. It's really a privilege to be asked to moderate today's session because, for me, Google was really the most formative experience of my career. And even though I left Google in 2011, I can confidently say it was my favorite place to work. It's where I learned the most. It had the biggest impact on me personally and professionally. And so just a really brief background on me so you understand where my questions are coming from and why I'm going to be hard on Saemin today. I'm originally from the US. I'm a San Francisco native, which I think is unusual actually. And I was responsible for starting the Google office here in Singapore. I was the first employee. I was the one who opened up the first door with the key and what have you and signed the first leases. I joined in 2002 when Google had almost no presence outside of Mountain View. It was a very small company. I think my employee number was 600 something. So it was a really, really small company at that time. It was an upstart. I know when you talk about that now, it seems a bit ridiculous. People go, Google's not a small company, come on. It was tiny at the time, and we had much bigger competitors. So it was very much a startup environment. It was a public company, and not much global footprint. And I think as a young, and I think a lot of you will probably identify with this, as a young entrant into the workforce and into the tech workforce, one of the best things you can possibly do is just go where their opportunities are. Not necessarily questioning whether or not you're actually capable of doing them or whether you're qualified, because I certainly was not. For me, the opportunity was internationally, first doing business development and partnerships in Europe, and then as we started to build out those offices, then go to the next frontier, which at that time was Asia. So strategic partnerships, syndication relationships, ads partnerships, and what have you. Commuting to Asia and then helping to open offices, because if you're already out there, you can do that too. And so helped to open offices in Australia, Japan, China, Korea, Hong Kong, and then eventually moved here to Singapore to be the first employee in the Singapore office, which is now multiple thousands of people down in Pasir Panjang. In one shape or another, I've been in Singapore now for almost 19 years. Left Google in 2011, went to Facebook to do pretty much the same thing to help expand Facebook into Asia. Facebook at that time was again a small company. Then left Facebook after 2 years to do an ad tech startup with ex-AdMob and Google people called Mopub. That company was acquired by Twitter, and then was in Twitter for 6 years, all here in the region. Then left because I got tired of big companies and 2 a.m. phone calls, and went and did a startup that I'm working on now in sustainable mobility, or the intersection of EV mobility and fintech. It's called Edde. And Saemin and I are going to talk about it after this conversation, but nevertheless, really excited to be here. And as I said, Google was and continues to be really the formative experience of my career, and that's where I intersected with the guy to my left. Saemin is the managing partner at Rakuten Capital. He helped establish the company's investment in ARM in 2014. I think that's right. 2014. And recently rejoined Rakuten after 2 years at 500 Global. Among his previous investments are a few companies you might have heard of, Carousel, OneSignal, and Gojek or Goto. Like a lot of us, Saemin has had a fascinating, diverse, and sometimes meandering path to his career. And I think that can be a really interesting point of conversation as well, which is that I think if all of us are honest, sometimes you don't plan this out, decades in advance, and it's the fortuitous kind of things that come along the way that ultimately are really impactful. So I'm excited to get into that with him. I also want to talk to you about sort of the world of VC, both globally and here in the region, regional startups and the trends that you see. And also just sort of how to make sense of the upheaval in the world that we're all experiencing over the past several months, and certainly the last 24 hours.
Indeed.
So I would like all of you to please join me in welcoming Saemin. My first question to you, as a Korean based in Singapore who works for a Japanese company, what is the identity you kind of claim for yourself?
Be always confused, but be confident. Well, actually, funny story. I became a Singaporean about 3 months ago. So
congratulations.
I converted to be a Singaporean, and my kids and my daughters and my sons are very, very happy about this. And well, it's an interesting story because in many ways, Japanese corporations, in large part, are a relationship-driven initiative. So no matter how smart you are or what's on your CV, more than anything, building the trust within the executive ranks and also the working class ranks actually really is becoming the most important thing. It's been the most important thing, but as you actually get into this very integrated society, because in Rakuten, there are thousands and thousands of foreigners. So whereas before, building trust used to be very homogenized into start early in the company and build yourself up, build your reputation, and build your visibility. Now think about a random Korean person going into a Japanese company, building a venture capital firm in Singapore. It's like the trifecta of risk appetite that you would want to take, right? So in many ways, I really ingratiated myself to understand what trust is, how to cement trust quickly so that you can do big needle-moving things.
That makes sense. And with those kind of multiple hats that you have worn and continue to wear, how has that influenced your sort of the direction of your career in tech?
Gotcha. Some people view ambiguity as something that they view as risk. I view that as immense comfort, because my whole modus operandi to doing business is absorbing as much information as possible and then basically enabling myself to understand what moves the needle in this market and in that market. Actually, Chris gets my newsletter, so he knows how confused I am every single day. But I basically aggregate everything that's happening on the finance, geopolitical, tech, and whatnot. And that allows me to make an informed choice. And if you kind of parlay that to what makes a VC stand out, VCs are in many ways simply a capital deployer. So each person has to find his or her own secret sauce to ensure that they can get the best deal access, but also help guide the company in the right way, especially in the growth stage of those investments. So because of that, that's how I've been activating. And the uncertainty has been in many ways a real comfort, because I can actually tell people what's going to happen for their businesses or how it's going to happen to a certain level of confidence. And once you keep on doing that as a motor function, it becomes second nature, so that you can be more predictive, more helpful for those companies.
I think a lot of folks, and myself included, would like to understand, how did you get to this point? Like, what was the impetus for your original career in tech? Not sort of the entire journey, but what really got you into this sort of space, and was it a grand plan, or is it just a bunch of happenstance?
I wish I was smart enough to have this plan, but it wasn't. It was a lot of pivots, a lot of my head getting kicked in because I wanted to do something and failing and whatnot. I think the weird thing about falling into specifically venture capital and later a general class of investments was basically like I was in Rakuten, I was in Google, and there was a point where I moved myself to the business development department, and I was running the knowledge department, the search department of there, and I was actually having a lot of trouble with upward mobility. And at that time, my wife was also having a baby, like in Singapore. And having kids and having a family is very expensive in Singapore. So we opened up our Google Sheets, and I said, if my wife doesn't work, what does my kind of income statement look like? And like we were like, hey, honey, what's wrong? Everything seems red here. It's so basically I was trying to look for a more substantial pay raise in terms of what I could do. And because my overall instinct was actually just to provide for my family, I looked high and low for any job that would provide that sort of quantum increase. The weird thing is that, just to get a little bit geeky, is that in the middle of that, I was actually pitching Rakuten a Google product. At that time, you called it rich snippets, where if you were to actually Google something, say you said like Mandarin Oriental Hotel, and then if you remember like 10 years back, the Mandarin Oriental will pop up and a small star would appear. If you guys remember, like a small review star, and that's called rich snippets. And my job was to convince Rakuten and to actually tag their whole SKU so that we can actually find that data and source better outcomes for the search results. And at that time, I kind of had a war of words with the manager that I was interfacing with. And then that manager called the managing director of Rakuten at that time, and we had this giant discussion about the pitfalls and the risk appetites and the downsides of Rakuten doing specific businesses. I literally ran on a rant, and I walked out, and I said, I'm not getting this business with Rakuten. And then about a month later, that manager called me to say, why don't you work at Rakuten? And that's literally how it happened. So, like, let it be known that sometimes emotional outbursts can actually help your career, right? It can. And that's kind of how I started in Rakuten. I started as a very traditional strategic investment office investor, like a corporate investor, right? And then again, they made the wrong choice of hiring a Korean person in Singapore to run their VC firm. And I basically ripped up a lot of the playbooks that they had, which was very, very slow and very synergy driven, and basically built this into a very specific venture capital firm like vehicle. And I started to rapidly deploy from them, which ended up being like companies like Carousel, Goto, and so on and so forth.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, emotion can be both a tool and a crutch,
Mm.
and it can actually be a big issue in some respects. Certainly in negotiations, it's a useful tool in certain circumstances. When I first came to Singapore for Google, one of the things we had to do was source local data for things like maps and local search. And I was extremely frustrated with the government. And I had some very unpleasant meetings with like the LTA, for example, and IDA and EDB and other government agencies. It was from those outbursts that I ended up on government boards because they said, we want somebody who will tell us the truth.
Indeed.
So it does happen that if you show people who you really are, and that, I think more importantly, that if you stand up for things you believe in and show that you're in this not just as a salesperson, but that actually you believe in what you're trying to say, then that can go a long way toward helping you.
Indeed, I think like showing commitment, manifesting commitment in your voice and how you carry yourself, it's a lost art, and I think people can really learn from that, right? Being confident in what you want and how you want it and how you can actually help the person. I think if you can do that and make that a very second nature kind of behavior, I think it'll be very helpful for everyone.
So you just touched on this transition from leaving Google as a business development person, as technically an operator, into investment. And you made some reference to how you kind of single-handedly changed the remit of what the original intent was for this office. But you were brand new to investing at that time.
Yes.
So I guess what I'm curious about is, who taught you how to do this? Did you have a mentor?
Yeah.
Were there other venture firms that you kind of shadowed? Or how did you figure out how to do the job?
This is very unfortunate this is being recorded, but I didn't know anything. I really faked it until I made it. And I haven't made it yet, okay? So I simply had a very specific idea of how investment should be done. And I had no biases on what a liquidation preference was or how a company was valued. I simply looked at it in terms of, is this a good business or a bad business? And then from there, I started to read more fundamental, actually, macroeconomics and more things in relation to like, how do you value a company's cash flow quality? How do you actually look at a company's PE ratio versus whatever the other the VC firms were actually looking at? So in many ways, my fundamentals were more based on common sense for business, and then understanding like, what does a PE player do? Because that is much more structured data that we can look at right now. And that later kind of evolved to, okay, let's discount XYZ factors, but look at alpha, beta, and then X together so that we can actually have a better shaded view of what actually makes sense. So a very good example of this is if I was only looking at private equity fundamentals, we never would have taken a very big commitment for Carousel, because all they had was massive amounts of user bases for the longest time and massive amounts of free traffic. So we were able to kind of flip the script in terms of how do we actually prioritize these KPIs and these trends to put this to our advantage as preferred shareholders and investors.
So you sort of start this thing from scratch, but it sounds like there is some preconceived ideas on what it should do and how it should look that you're fighting against a little bit, or at least trying to kind of put your own spin on.
Yes.
What did it feel like to write your first check, make your first investment? I guess my question is, what did it feel like to make that first leap?
Gotcha. I thought it would feel really good. But all the legal, the working with the legal firm drained all the joy out of my first investment. It was interesting because we put in the first $500,000 check into Carousel at that time, where nobody was giving $500,000 checks to seed companies. We really believed in the trend that Southeast Asia was going through in terms of the listings platforms and the C2C platforms and whatnot. And we really felt joy in working with the likes of Shireen, Lucas, and Marcus. So on one end, like the legal rigmarole and the processes, these things were, of course, something that we had to get over. But we had immense kind of gratification to see the company succeed and grow, and for us to be as helpful as possible.
I've got a lot of friends in venture who have told me that one of the hardest things about this job relative to being an operator and certainly being in a sales or business development role is the long time horizon until you get some feedback as to whether you've done the right thing or not.
Yeah.
And especially with the first investment.
Indeed.
As somebody who had no track record in it, and really you were new to Rakuten as well, how did you defend the choice? What was the process internally for sort of saying, I believe in this company, I want to write this check, and putting your name on the line to say, go do it?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about Carousel is it wasn't like an innovative business. It was done to death by the likes of OfferUp, by the likes of Craigslist, to the likes of the Nasper family, right? So in many ways for us, it was easier to draw the parallel. If those things grew and became very sustainable and had immense shelf life staying power, then there was no reason why we couldn't actually do that for Carousel. I would say that the Carousel view was a little bit more atypical because the company took off so quickly, so early on. And then you had an immense venture boom in Southeast Asia at the same time. So I think those things coalesced so that we were able to kind of get on that train and ride it towards different investments that were equally productive.
Let's pivot a little bit. I want to talk about lucky breaks and missed opportunities. And it doesn't have to be just about your life as a VC, but even just your broader career. I think most of us, as I said earlier, if we're honest, we've had a mix of lucky breaks and missed opportunities in our careers. And if you're honest with yourself, you can kind of identify all of those and not necessarily take credit for the breaks and not beat yourself up too much about the opportunities that you missed. What's a lucky break that came your way that in hindsight has had a really big or disproportionate impact? And then what's at least one missed opportunity you wish you had back?
Gotcha. I mean, my lucky break 100% was joining Rakuten inadvertently. And this is, I make this joke, but I'm very embarrassed too. But when I talked about my manager calling me like a month, that manager calling me like a month later to see if I go over to work with Rakuten, the connection was bad. So I equally heard it as Rakuten and Saboten. So like the tonkatsu place. So I'm like, so you're calling me as the restaurant manager. Would you like to work in a tonkatsu restaurant? I've seen your LinkedIn profile, and I took this very seriously. So, but again, humor aside, it was the fact that I was given an opportunity, and I think the lucky break was I was at a time in my life where I saw all risk factors as an opportunity to prove myself, because I am a massively insecure person by nature, and I try to improve myself every single day in trying to show that I can be of value to people around myself, but also for the fact that when somebody believes in me, I put in the extra effort to actually show that I can manifest what they want from me, right?
A little less serious. What's something you enjoy like consistently almost every day about what you do?
You just get to meet with the smartest people. You get to also meet with it's very hard for a lot of employees or workers or people who are doing entrepreneurship to always meet driven people. And venture capital and investment is in a place where you always are able to look at and feel ambition in your interactions with people. So I think that's one of the most things that a lot of people, even the CEOs, actually don't get to interface with. And it's a very thrilling engagement that you have with companies, whether they're right or wrong about the business that they're building out. It's a rare treat and a privilege to always be able to look at founders and CEOs who want to build something that's outside of the bounds of what we're doing today.
What's one thing you wish founders understood about what you do that they don't seem to get?
This is going to be a jab at a lot of other GPs as well as myself. Is the GPs might say something very, very confidently. Your job is to say no to what the idea that they're giving you 99.9% of the time. Because a lot of times, a lot of GPs, even myself, we in many ways parrot out what used to work before. So heuristics does not pertain to a future solution. So trying to be able to not only be very stubborn about your business and your vision, but at the same time, balance that artfully with being endlessly open-minded. So even if you say no 100 times, don't get tired of hearing advice or guidance from founders or investors that you work with, because that one thing that you actually agree with, that could be the change maker for how your business performs. So the open-mindedness balance and the stubborn-mindedness balance, the yin-yang, getting that right, I think is so important in doing this entrepreneurship journey.
Let's talk about Rakuten Capital for a few minutes. What's the stage at which you typically invest, typical check size, like the standard stuff that you guys kind of do? Do you follow? Like, can you give me the 30-second overview of what you guys, how you look at it?
Sure. It's a really good question because in many ways for me, my job is to run Rakuten Capital, which is the whole co of maybe 3 or 4 funds that exist inside Rakuten. So Rakuten Capital, and underneath that, there's Rakuten Venture, which I used to found and run. And there's like a fintech fund, and there's a mobility fund, there's an e-commerce fund. So all of these guys normally activate in the ranges of the early Series A to about mid-B stages of their life cycle. So maybe to anywhere between a $5 to $10 million check that they will put in for maybe an equity of maybe 5 to 9% of the company. Now that's kind of the more traditional venture capital side. I also have a mandate for looking at larger check sizes and larger investment practices. So anywhere between 50 to 100 million US dollars, that could be very interesting for the future of Rakuten. I also have a mandate to look at and potentially underwrite. Along with that, Rakuten Capital has the responsibility to do M&A activities. So if a subsidiary from Rakuten comes to me and says, I need this fintech company, I will have to either underwrite the acquisition or say no to the acquisition in many ways. So it's a good harmony of investment and acquisitionary actions, as well as like trying to interface with sovereign funds to see what interesting projects that we can build out for the future.
As nominally a corporate VC, how much I understand at the later stage, what you just mentioned, but in the earlier stage, like Rakuten Ventures, how much do those investments have to align with Rakuten, the company?
It really depends on the mood of the IC.
Great answer.
Yes. So right now, the Nikkei is not doing so hot, yeah? So you want to find really synergistic companies to actually invest. I'm just kidding. So what this really aligns with is the great part about, an amazing part about Rakuten, it has like 70, 80 subsidiaries, right? It has a golf booking site, 2 Viber. It has Rakuten Cashback, right? We sponsor the Golden State Warriors. Why? Don't ask me. But anyway, we also have Vicky, right? So for me to marry a synergistic benefit is very, very easy. So because of that big benefit, you have to exploit it. So what's my exploitation? I try to find the best companies, whether technically or business model-wise, and then try to find a fluid narrative towards how that actually helps one of our subsidiaries. And for us, that's worked persistently well. Companies have been able to work well with our subsidiaries and so on and so forth.
Okay, that's a really good segue into talking about sort of broadly the trends focus that I think everyone wants to hear more from you on. AI is obviously the flavor of the, I'm not going to say month because it's been a while now, but maybe the year or the couple of years. What excites you about AI as a trend, and also what gives you pause?
Gotcha. I think there's a couple of things. Let me just answer the what gives you pause first. It's that when you have artificial intelligence bringing up so much potential to impact all verticals of society and all stencils of society, there is always an aggressive and over-correcting maneuver that corporations will make along with the hyperscalers, right? So in 2024, there was about $57 billion invested just in trying to refit data centers with GPU cards and different TensorFlow mechanisms. And now you're going to have 2025, about $150 to $200 billion invested in the sunk cost. This gives me pause because that's an immense amount of sunk cost that is actually built into these initiatives, that if these things falter in terms of their KPI and growth, it causes massive negative impacts across the public equity sector and the private equity sector where we live in. Why is that more prevalent now? Because the Mag 7 garners about 30 to 45% of all of the S&P 500 NASDAQ growth rate, right? So if 30 to 40% of your body mass underperforms and you get sick, everyone gets sick. So overcorrection always gives me a lot of pause, and this is something that I view very specifically macroeconomically. Now, what gives me a lot of hope is that irrespective of each of the silos of great development, whether it's the US, whether it's North Asia, whether it's China, each one has their own genealogy because of their geopolitical proclivities. You know, one of the most amazing things is, of course, how much AI is being pushed. LLM models are being pushed out of China, right? They're developing a whole different evolutionary chain in terms of how to make compute on the training side and inference side productive, much more so than the US, right? So you have guys like DeepSeek, of course, with V3 and R1 pumping out. And on that point, there's a whole other industry on the software side supporting all of those initiatives, right? Everything from synthetic data generation to heterogeneous compute aggregation to things like model routing. These things were very, very alien when we talked about it, even as generalized experts maybe 2 to 3 years ago. Now, these have become basic building blocks of building really good LLMs and AI models. So I think the sheer innovation that happens specifically either because you have so much money or so much resources, or because you're locked into your own peninsula so much, it becomes a great study and a great topic to invest in.
Okay. Besides AI,
Mhm.
what are some of the other areas that you're most excited about? And you're not allowed to say the intersection of EV mobility and fintech because that's my stuff.
Yeah,
But
the intersection of EV mobility.
Besides that, which is incredibly exciting.
Yeah. So indeed. So maybe 3 specific verticals if you look at this in terms of a 5 to 15-year breadth of evolution. One is robotics, right? There's so much activity going on in the robotics industry, especially that of the US and Chinese players, that you really can't ignore them. One of the biggest innovations or evolutions that have happened specifically in China is that all of the robotic servo parts, the actuators, all the ball bearing mechanisms, there's a massive coalescence with the automotive industry, which has also had a massive renaissance in China. So we from one point of robot bipedal, quadrupedal automation to the next of being able to buy an Agibot quadrupod for $7,000, we've actually crossed that chasm without any bumps. That's amazing. So people are literally able to buy quadrupedal, high-level APU, CPU robots, and it's very commercially scalable. So I think robotics is such an interesting industry. Then you go to aerospace, which is massively interesting because you have the defense industry actually start up reverting, right? Look at Anduril, right? They're building out literally drones and different defense mechanisms that enable people to be much more safer. Unfortunately, the theater of war has increased and quickened that evolution, right? So now if you look at a sort of weird segment and evolution, is that if you look at defensive and offensive drone capabilities, right? Like an offensive drone, now you go to the battlefield and you have a whole different evolution of fiber optic based spools that give the attack drones, the one that's explode, like 5 to 10 kilometer variability and also range. Then you have very interesting things that are happening on the energy sector, right? By 2042, China will have 150 full-size nuclear reactors, right? Right now, China produces more than 32% more electricity than all of the United States, right? So it's going to become massively energy rich. So because of that, energy competition, energy sovereignty will become very important. So that's why you have players like the Gates Foundation looking at small modular reactors and so on and so forth. So I think those specific 3 industries will be very, very important. I think the 4th one that's becoming very important, of course, is bioinformatics and computational biology. To be able to quicken the ability for you to build biosimilitude therapeutics and also build different gene correlating and calibration mechanisms that enable you to even correct deficiencies or disorders that you have in the body. So
Okay.
4 specific things.
Thanks, Saemin. One last question from me, and then we'll open up for questions. And it's kind of related to what you were just talking about. If you were not a venture capitalist right now, and you were trading places and coming to pitch you, what is the problem you wish somebody was working on? What is the company you would like to see founded right now and coming to pitch for business?
Gotcha. I mean, one of the most exciting parts for me would be definitely on the computational biology segment of the market. Because we're at a point where there are studies coming out. Actually, like 1 or 2 days ago, they just cloned the dire wolf, right? And they called it Romulus and Remus, right? But we're getting to a stage where people are able to augment human capabilities. It's already been done before, but now we're getting to a commercially scalable state. When CRISPR came out, maybe like more than 15, 20 years ago, and they got the Nobel Prize for that, there were scientists in China that were trying to figure out how to make people HIV resistant. And what they found out was if they were to eliminate the Cas9 protein neuron receptor, they were able to make these people much more resistant to the HIV virus. But the massive, crazy side effect was it increased neuroplasticity by 35%. People became smarter because they didn't have that protein neuron receptor. But they also became massively susceptible to the West Nile virus, right? Right, this is like, I read this stuff, I'm like, oh my God, this is so good. And my wife is like, hey, eat your food, man. Like, this is like, I geek out on this. But what I'm trying to say is that all of that dichotomy of potential is now being slowly scaled in markets like China, in markets in Europe. So computational biology is massively going to be impactful for the human race.
Fantastic. Thanks. I think I'll stop, and I'd love for anyone who'd like to ask anything of Saemin, please just raise your hand and we'll go around the room.
I got a question. We got involved in building a few things in sort of the ad tech space. One of the things we've started to discuss a lot is the fact that it's getting extremely cheap and easy to build things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like from an investor's point of view,
yeah.
like I'm assuming that in the olden days, like technology, and
yeah.
like where does, how do you view this? Like where's the unique value if anyone can build it quickly?
It's a really good question because what you say directly impacts, for example, the SaaS industry as a whole, right? Because if you hobble together maybe 4 or 5 open source projects, you can literally build a HubSpot or a Salesforce tomorrow, right?
The example I always use.
Oh, great. We're in the same mind here, right? So, but and what's important is I don't invest in that then. Yeah. But what's interesting is that because of that, price discovery becomes so hard to do, right? There's companies that have literally like valued at like $4 or $5 billion, and their ARR is like $200-300 million, and you actually look at the under the bonnet, it's a GPT-4 wrapper, right? What am I supposed to do with this, right? And for them to go to the route of building their own model is kind of defeating the purpose of being capital efficient. So we've had to really look and soul search when we actually do target selection and whatnot. The existing SaaS investments we've made, thankfully, are okay because they're already financially very sturdy, and they have their moat in terms of guarding their actual customers and acquiring new customers. What I do see with a lot of SaaS companies, like you say, is every single one worth their salt has their own CAO, Chief Automation Officer. Basically, they'll hire like a hacker, growth hacker type of dude, and they'll go across all of their processes, sales, technical account management, to even engineering or even bug updating, and they'll use that team to basically automate as much as possible of their development process. So I think that's one big thing that's happening is people are actively hacking themselves into becoming massively effective. Now, the people who aren't are the ones who are going to get the short end of the stick, right? But then again, it's already happening on the corporate side. Mark Benioff from Salesforce literally said he will no longer hire engineers this year, right? I remember back when we were in Google, Hyderabad literally had a giant AutoML project where basically it enabled them to not hire L2 and L3 engineers, right? That was Project Apollo, and it really worked. So Hyderabad office shrunk immensely because of that, right? So these giant leaps of efficiency also impact how companies are valued, so we're very careful of that.
I'm curious, is there anything that you miss about the corporate world that you found is really hard to find on the VC side, or just doesn't really exist?
Yeah,
cafes.
The cafes. Do you know like no, I mean, so there's a difference. Like, you know, if you go to a more traditional corporation, you don't get the perks, right? But I literally was in Pasir Panjang on the Google campus like a month ago, and I said, can I have an espresso, please? And there's a barista, human barista, and I asked them like, and then the person asked me like, what bean do you want? And I'm like, I'm sorry, like if it's black and it tastes bitter, that's what I want. So no, just the perks are great, but definitely on the corporate side in Rakuten Venture, what's great is I get to touch everything. In many ways, commercial VC, you are beholden fiduciarily to only focus on investment and specific parts of your investment practice, right? On the corporate side, just because of our remit, I can one day touch a $1 billion acquisition M&A. The next day, I'm on the trading desk with our treasury team to see how we can hedge some of the holdings that we have, right? So I also handle and help out on the public equity desk side on Rakuten.
I would imagine that's different than what a typical pure VC might say, because they're not touching all those other pieces, so they don't get the diversity of experience.
Yes, yes. My ADD brain is just right for the job that I got today. Yeah.
Yeah.
My name is Jisoo. Thank you so much. I think my question is, when do you choose to leave versus when do you choose to stay and change? For example, when you said you joined Rakuten and the culture was very slow and things weren't moving fast enough, you definitely have an option to go somewhere else where things are moving faster already, but you choose to stay and change that. So just curious to see when you make decisions, when you choose to leave.
I mean, I'd also like to hear Alex's discussion point, because my mindset about like when do I leave or stay has changed drastically as I've gotten older. When I was like in my 30s, I had no patience, right? And patience was a rare commodity for a lot of people in my field. But I guess as I grew older, I just got to understand that sometimes you really have to take a step back and eat a humble pie and understand what difference you're making, and you have to consistently abstract the importance that you feel for yourself and not try to personify that to the manager that you have or to the company that you have, right? Because a lot of times when you say, oh, I'm burned out and things are moving too slowly, it's because you're not getting enough progress, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes the progress that you deserve is not what you have as a person. So for me, I think if you asked me this question when I was like 32, I would say that, oh, I give myself 6 months and I'm out of here. I wasn't that zesty, but anyway, but nobody laughs. Okay, but but I'd say that now I really try to think about what am I doing right and what am I doing wrong, right? And this is going back to thinking about those moments of setbacks and progress. If you have setbacks, you really have to have a short-term memory towards those setbacks and keep on moving, right? And keep on trying to gain your own type of traction, because that also makes your identity.
Thanks, Saemin. Just to add to that, you have to know what your strengths and weaknesses are and really be honest about both. And for me, I knew that I was more effective, more capable, happier, more motivated in earlier stage, smaller, higher growth environments. When companies got really big, it brings in a different type of skill sets, it brings in a different type of management style, it brings in different KPIs or OKRs, since we're all ex-Google. It changes everything. And there's a group of people that thrive in that environment. I knew I wasn't one of those people. And you can fight against the tide as much as you try, but at some point you say, you know what? Like, my skill set fits better in this other situation. So that sometimes becomes the decision point. At least it was for me multiple times. Was like, this is feeling a bit big, a bit political, a bit boring. Like, I want to go back and do that earlier stage stuff because it's more fun. Other people might hate that earlier stage stuff because it's volatile, there's no security, what have you. So I think knowing yourself is really important. And as Saemin said, it's stage of career, stage of life. For me, at least when I decided to leave Google, partly was size issue, but it was also like, I had started at Google as a relatively junior person and I had progressed up, but a lot of Singaporeans in the room, do you guys know what CEP is? So like career expected potential, it's basically in the government, they determine from an early stage on, this is as far as you're going. And it's very hard to escape that. And I think even in private enterprise, and certainly I think even any kind of thing, some people determine for you early on what your potential is. And if you feel like you start to hit up against that ceiling and you can't help but think, hey, I've got more to offer and I'm not going to be able to exploit that here, that's usually a pretty good signal that it's time to look somewhere else. If you have that ambition and you feel like you're fighting against the current at a place you're at, it's a good time to start to think, well, maybe I can fulfill my destiny somewhere else. On the other hand, there is a grass is greener problem everywhere you go. Yeah. And there's a reason why I said at the beginning of my introduction that Google continues to be my favorite place I ever worked, including the company I own. And I know Google today is not the Google of back then, but I give that as a caveat, but genuinely, like, don't overlook the current experiences for something you assume to be better. Oftentimes, you're in the best of times and you don't know it. You first.
Hi, I'm Marcus Theo. 2 questions. Thank you for your sharing. Can you share about the setback that you mentioned? I think often we learn a lot from some of the things that didn't go so well. So in terms of like possibly what's the worst investment that you've made?
Gotcha.
You don't have to share the name if you don't want.
Yeah, so it was actually in an ad tech company, a mobile DSP company. That was, yeah,
Only
right?
invest in SSPs.
I
okay?
know. I know. So it was an ad tech company that did the mobile demand sale platform, and the company was doing amazing, and it was really weird because it was at a time when there was like a mobile advertising renaissance, and this company scaled to like $60 million for the first year, like $70 million for the first year. It got massive contracts, and and at one point the business didn't fail because it was at one point just on an automatic rail to success. But what started to happen was that the founders started to fight a lot. They fought like cats and dogs. It was insane. But for me, as still a very young investor, I was like, hey, if the numbers are right, the company's all right, right? But what I didn't realize is that because they were fighting, they had stopped developing their company and platform, and their team stopped developing the technology necessarily to stay ahead. So 1 second they were on top, and the next day they were completely crashing in terms of revenue. There was a big issue with an ad agency that wasn't happy with the company. So everything spiraled out of control. And I can tell you, I lost 20 million from that, right? Think about the LP, which is Rakuten, trusting me with 23 million US dollars, and that going to complete zero, right? So that was the biggest setback that gave me massive pause in terms of whether I'm actually right for the venture capital ecosystem. We're actually wondering what I'm actually doing here. But the harshest of lessons that I've learned for those failures, it gave me so much life lessons about the essence of human nature, how to talk with people, how to look at things, and how to actually appreciate risk, right? But definitely, that was probably my biggest kind of soccer kick to the head.
I'm Sam Chang. I used to work at GoGrow, so I'm happy to, talk about Edde afterwards.
Sure.
Information. And I'm currently a student here at SMU doing a master's in finance, but I'm also part-time at a VC. My question is trying to figure out, so my internship goes until next month, trying to figure out how to grow as a, in VC. I think the work is highly interesting because we're sector agnostic. And I'm not native to this part of the world, but it's very interesting, more emerging markets. Trying to figure out what to do after this internship to keep on growing. Do you have any advice for, students or people just getting more so, started in venture capital on how to best use their time?
I mean, 100%. If you're starting out, it's really important that you find a vertical and an industry you really love or you're passionate about. And that passion is very temporal. Next year it could be a different industry that you like, or next year it could be something that you return back to. But really building an acute expertise in the vertical that you want and understand, it doesn't have to make a lot of money. Like, it doesn't seem to have a giant TAM, what I'm trying to say. Because your GP, as agnostic as he or she is in investing, they will never have the expertise that you'll have for the passion of the vertical that you have. They might, but there's a higher chance you'll have a lot to offer, right? Building that expertise as densely, as quickly as possible, then offering those insights and how that matriculates to an investment thesis is something that, number one, is very hard to do. Because an idea to an actual investment practice, it's like pulling teeth out of your face. But one thing that you can do in that process is you have to get used to that sort of hard work, that hard process. And once you actually have that ability and that muscle to build that investment thesis to investment process, then you have an advantage that's unique, that could be monetized, whether it's in the same the VC firm or different finance firms. One thing that I would actually recommend everyone do if they're an investor at heart is try to not only look at venture capital, but look at all the other asset classes there are in the world. Because if you look at debt, there's a whole interesting world that actually opens up to you. Look at what public equity is doing. Look at actually the asymptotic rise of private credit that's happening right now, and what the Trump administration is doing to the actual private credit vertical. And you understand that the more physics you understand about the macroeconomics and geopolitics of the world, that directly benefits your ability to invest correctly.
Other questions?
First one is, Can you talk about career development and career progression, whether if someone in a room is in their 20s versus 30s versus 40s, what you recommend they do if they're trying to get into venture capital?
Gotcha. I mean, for me, the way that I did it was I saw myself as a toolbox, like a philosophical toolbox, and I try to put as much things in the box, and I keep on putting stuff in the box as I grow now, right? But when I was young, I made sure that I just wanted to learn about advertising and ad tech as much as possible. So I went into the inside sales organization at Google. Before that, I did a bunch of BD for a company. I also did a lot of business development for Google and so on and so forth. Because in the end, a person who deploys capital, outside the capital, they are useful to their founders and to the investments that they make. So if you don't have experiences that they don't have, you are less useful to them, right? So don't send them a Joe Rogan episode, right? Just you have, yeah. See, thank you, Alison.
No, I'm laughing because that happens.
Yeah, look at this guy. Why don't you just emulate them? But you really have to find out ways that you can help them build their next modality. So when I was doing a lot of investment in Rakuten Venture, because I was doing like Series B and beyond, what I noticed that a lot of founders, they knew exactly how to run their company for the next maybe 9 to 12 months. What ends up happening is because they know exactly what they're doing for those 12 months, they don't know what they're going to do in terms of building out the next version of their company for the next 3 years. So I built up the expertise of how to build a company, right? So if you look at Carousel literally is a mirror image of how I learned about business, right? Are you going to be a one-trick pony in terms of just looking at trying to be a listings company? Or are you going to start to verticalize and conglomerize your business to de-risk assets and increase cash flow, right? A very private equity play. So the actual evolution of Carousel in many ways reflects how a normal company that doesn't have a lot of funding grows and succeeds. So that's kind of the thought process that I would take.
I guess, like, just to add to that, I think most of us in this room have some peripheral connection to Google, if not actually all worked there at one point. It's not the only company in the world where you can learn these kinds of special things, but for both Saemin and myself, the breadth of experience that you get, no matter what your role is really special, and you shouldn't underestimate it. And I think the one piece of advice that I try to give myself a lot is you don't know what you know. And it's incredibly valuable to other companies, your experience. So don't undersell it. Don't underestimate your own experience having broad applicability beyond what you might even imagine. And I think that's probably been your experience.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Alexander and myself are a little bit, I would say, materially more lucky because we came in a stage where Google was very, very amorphous, right? I was in the what is it? What is it? The one that looks like a giant metal
Temasek Tower?
No, AXA Tower.
Oh, yeah. Well, now it's
now
same
it's
thing,
gone,
same
right?
building. Yeah, it's gone. The
So
giant phallic thing at Shenton Way. Yeah.
Okay, phallic. Okay. But
You were trying to be careful,
yes,
and
yes.
I just don't care.
But I remember sitting. The whole office would actually do a stand-up. Thank God it's Friday stand-up, and 70 people was the whole office, right? So at one point we could be working on inside sales, and then the business development team at that time would come over and say, "Hey, do you have any connection with like a Telkomsel? We want to do a distribution deal." So we were very lucky to be able to jump in terms of roles and responsibilities. And I hope that you can find out a way to actually broaden your experience base in a similar manner.
Yeah. Other questions?
I think building on some of the previous questions as well and what you just said about having a breadth of experience to help you guide the founders better. If you had to put a theoretical timeline to a corporate plus VC career, what do you think would be a good time to get into VC? And what would be the kind of work that you should do?
Maybe not this week.
No, yeah, that's definitely not this week. Don't look at the Nasdaq. But 100%, I would say as soon as possible. If you don't know the exact mechanisms about venture capital or a specific business, your passion and drive is the most important commodity you're going to utilize to actually build performance, right? And with that passion, you're going to read up a lot. You're going to be talking to a lot of people to how to do business and so on and so forth. So you can really learn on the job because in many ways, the remit always changes, right? For some companies, you get lucky because you drank too many times with that guy in Mission Street and you get to put in a check and it's that Stripe. Oh my God, it's Stripe, right? But at the same time, you go into a company and you invest in a company and they struggle for the next, like 5, 10 years, but you're able to help them continuously with business connections and business development, and somehow they become a massive success, right? So your origin of success is always shifting. So just be prepared, I would say, to act faster and also commit faster to something wholeheartedly.
Okay, last question. Chris?
Can you talk about the most successful pitch process that you've seen? How should someone here or watching the video later on prepare to pitch someone like you or a different VC?
Gotcha.
Or not so you just the fundraising process.
Gotcha. I mean, definitely the pitch does not happen at the pitch. You should be able to, because we have so much information and we have Grok and we have Gemini, literally, if you're going to try to find the investor that you want to pitch to, you can literally find what that investor is looking for as of now, right? So you want to qualify what investors like to look at your vertical or your business, right? Once you qualify that, then you want to actually focus on why is this more personable to the investor than not, right? So you build a lot of the story behind why this is important and why this actually can provide eventually a large TAM for yourself. But that pre-qualification and that personability, I believe, has been persistently successful in getting money out of me.
What's the other side of the coin? What are the most typical mistakes people make to kind of shoot themselves in the foot with you?
Like they'll send like me like MailChimp things and then it's like dear and it's like a giant bracket because they forgot to format it correctly, right? Or like they'll like send me to their banker. I'm like, you're a Series B guy. Why are you talking? Why is your banker from JP Morgan interfacing with me, right? So yeah, those things. Like try to be personable, try to be passionate, and understand if the investor is actually interested in the business itself.
Fantastic. We're at time. I think I speak for everybody saying thank you to Saemin for being so candid, sharing so much of himself. Really, really informative. I learned a lot about somebody that I've known for a long time.